Welcome to USNH this cold morning. I'm Peggy Ray from the stewardship team. And as you know, the stewardship campaign, where we make our pledges for financial support for the next fiscal year, is now underway. And you will have already gotten your appeal letters explaining why we need your support. For the next few weeks, somebody from our team will be here each week to remind you to make your pledge. You can also, if you're here in person, after the service, pick up a pledge form from Amy, one of our team members. She'll be at a table either in the social hall or in the lobby. And of course, you can also make your pledge online, or you can call or email the office to get a pledge form. We each have our own reasons for why we want USNH to continue. And here's Becky Reeve to tell us about hers.
Thank you, Peggy. Morning, everybody. As Peggy said, my name is Becky Reeve. I've been coming to USNH since 2014, and with my two lovely children who don't want me to point them out, so I won't. Name Liam and Audrey. And I came to USNH because of the kids. I was raised Catholic, but I didn't really see any reason to subject them to that whole experience. And I'm sure, I think some of you know what I'm talking about. So I did feel some responsibility to provide them with a sort of spiritual grounding, even when I wasn't quite sure what I meant by that. I just knew it felt like something important, and I really didn't want to be the one taking sole responsibility for it, because I still feel like I'm trying to figure out what am I doing? And I stumbled upon USNH at a retreat that I attended here that was run by a choral group that I used to sing with many years ago. And as I was walking down the halls, because the retreat was in the children's chapel, I remember being very confused by what I was seeing, and not in a bad way. Just a kind of whoa, what is this place? It reminded me a little bit of my church, but not. So it kind of was, but it wasn't in all the good ways that it wasn't, And I can't really remember the details now, but I knew by what I was seeing that this just might be the place that I was looking for. And I didn't come right away. It was a couple of years gap. But when I did eventually come, what I noticed immediately was how welcoming it all was here. We profess to be a welcoming congregation, and right from the very beginning, I experienced that radical sense of welcome. You walk in the door and you are seen, immediately, even on days when you really don't want to be seen, you are. And I'm a bit of an introvert, so it was hard to go into an unfamiliar place where you don't really know anybody. But pretty quickly, I began to feel like I was a part of it all. In fact, the first Sunday that I brought the kids, who were 4 and 6 at the time, and 12 and 14 now, for reference. I sat at the back row over there, and they were kind of, restless, as kids are. And there was another member sitting in the same row, and at some point she kind of scooted over, and she started making origami animals out of the order of service for them. And I just remember being blown away by this really beautiful, welcoming gesture. And then it wasn't long before Jesse, we kept coming, and Jesse eventually invited the kids to class. And then I kind of got to see how things worked around here. And before I knew it, a few years had passed. I was teaching some of the RE classes, much to my amazement. But it allowed me to get to know more people and to get to know some of the kids. And it made me feel like I was contributing, like I was making a difference. And there were buddy programs and soup Sundays, book sales, so many things to do around here. Some of the things that I got to do, and many of them that I couldn't. So I came because of the kids, but I stayed because of the beauty of this community. And really for community, which is really hard to find these days. I mean, to have a place to go where people know your name is a real gift. And yet this place is vast enough that there are still always new people to meet that you don't know, which is really cool. And there are always new things to try that you can become involved in. As a parent of school-aged kids, you kind of get wrapped up in like the RE program and the child-centered activities. And this, along with trying to fit the rest of your life that isn't work or school into a vanishingly small amount of free time they have on the weekends, means that you miss a lot of things. But I think one of the best things about USNH is that it can grow with you. I just signed up for my first small ministry group with Jesse that I'm very excited about. And it kind of feels like an amazing shift, like the stars aligned to allow me to actually like do this, that it actually like worked out. So it makes me look forward to a time when my obligations begin to change and loosen, and then I can become involved in all the other things that I really wanted to do. Over the years, I found that USNH has a way of bringing you in if you allow it, especially if you let those nominating people get a hold of you. Like, they're really convincing. But it really all just starts with showing up, and it takes trust. You have to trust yourself, you have to trust the people around you, but if you can allow yourself to just let go into the experience, it can really bring you to some wonderful places. And finally, that's why I give. I give so that USNH is here for the future, and not just my future, but for those who come after me as well. After all, in life, all we ever really have is this moment right here, right now. So if we don't secure the future of USNH now, who will? So thank you very much for your time.
So I'd like to invite the USNH folk group up to sing for us while we light the chalice.
We'd like to lead you in Building Bridges, which is in your hymnal. We'll sing it together twice and then as a round twice. 1023.
Bridges between our divisions, I reach out to you. Will you reach out to me with all of our voices and all of our visions? Friends, we could make such sweet harmony, building bridges between our divisions. I reach out to you. Will you reach out to me with all of our voices and all of our visions? Friends, we could make such sweet harmony. Building bridges between our divisions. Building bridges between our divisions. I reach out to you. Will you reach out to me with all of our voices and all of our visions? Friends, we could make such sweet harmony. Building bridges between our divisions. I reach out to you. Will you reach out to me with all of
Hey, good morning. I'm Jim Peters. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a member of the worship committee, and along with Sue Lindsley, we welcome you to this in-person and live streamed service of the Unitarian Society of New Haven. We are a diverse, multi-generational faith community that inspires lives of compassion and generosity, nurtures spiritual growth, cultivates transformative connections, and creates a more just world. And we're so happy you're here with us this morning. If you're visiting us for the first time, a special welcome to you and an invitation to come for refreshments in the social hall following the service. There's also a welcome table staffed by our connections team if you have any questions about USNH or Unitarian Universalism. We're so glad you're here today. This morning, we are very happy to welcome educator and traditional Native American storyteller Darlene Kazak of the Schaghticoke Tribal Nation. Ms. Kazak is the Education Director for the Institute of American Indian Studies, a nationally recognized teaching and resource center based in Washington, Connecticut. We're so glad you're here. If you're interested in learning more about the Institute, including ways to support its mission, you can visit the website, www.iaismuseum.org. I believe the link is in the order of service. Now, a few other announcements this morning. USNH will be honored by the UUA on Tuesday, February 28th at 7 p.m. on Zoom for our outstanding work in 2022 of being a good trouble congregation. Only about 20 other congregations have achieved this distinction. Speakers will include Reverend Susan Frederick Gray and Tiffany Flowers, Frontline Campaign Director. Let's show up in force for this national celebration. You can email uuthevote@usnh.org for more information. Couple other things. This is the last Sunday to sign up for small group ministries. If you see the table in the social hall, you can sign up. And the pastoral care team is in need of shawls and lap blankets, knitted, crocheted, or quilted. The shawl ministry provides a way to express our gratitude for each other and offer comfort to one another. We welcome donations that would be given to individuals as a tangible expression of shared joy or concern. If you'd like to make a shawl, but the cost is prohibitive, we can provide yarn. We also gladly accept donations of yarn. Prayer shawl patterns are available online and on the table next to the Joys and Concerns book in the front hall. For more information, contact Mary Losey. And now, with a reminder to make sure your electronic devices are silenced, our service continues with the sharing of joys and sorrows.
We understand that both joy and sorrow are part of the human condition. We also believe that when sorrow is shared, the burden may be lifted. When joy is shared, the happiness expands. Sometimes only a tear or a smile betrays a sorrow or joy not shared. I'm so pleased to announce that today, Peter Schwartz turns 80, so he has just become a member of a very elite group here. And Linda Barrett shares the loss of a friend and early childhood education mentor who passed away on Friday, February 17th. In this blessed community, we make space each week for silent meditation, knowing that the experience of every one of us matters, and together we are stronger.
Hello, everyone. I feel so honored to be here today. This is the first type of program that I've done in this manner. And I worried and I stressed about it and I said, what do I do? What do I do? And then an inner voice said, just be yourself. So that's what I'm going to do. So my name is Darlene Kasak. I am the education director for the Institute for American Indian Studies, but I'm a whole lot more than just that. I'm also a member of the Schaghticoke Tribal Nation. That's one of 5 tribes that exist to this day here in our own state. I am also a traditional Native American storyteller. And what that means is that I've been chosen by the Native American community based on things they saw in me to be the keeper of our stories. I learn my stories in a different way. I don't read them from a book or listen to a video. I sit with an elder, and an elder passes the story down to me by word of mouth. And it's my responsibility to memorize that story, remember that story, protect it, and pass it on. Some of the stories that I've learned are thousands of years old, and they've been kept intact through this tradition. My auntie said to me, you know, Darlene, if our people wrote everything down, what would have happened when forced assimilation came? All of those books would have been burned. So because we have this oral tradition, we were able to keep all of that alive. As a storyteller, it's also my responsibility to share the history of my people. And that, I think, is what drives me to do what I do. I've recently been given the opportunity to have a seat at the table in rewriting the curriculum for Connecticut's elementary to high school. And it is such an honor because for the first time, representatives from the 5 tribes are going to be able to work on how our stories are being told. So it's quite an honor. It's quite an undertaking as well, and a long time coming. I serve on what's called the Schaghticoke Women's Traditional Council. In our communities, we have checks and balances in place since time immemorial. We have a chief, we have a leader, but we have councils as well. For example, the chief or the leader may say he wants to go to war, but he couldn't go to war unless he had the approval of the Women's Council, because the Women's Council was in charge of the food stores. So they knew whether it was a good time or a bad time to go to war. The Women's Council would also suggest who would be most worthy to lead that tribe. And if that person wasn't leading the people in a good way, it's the Women's Council who would take that person out of that position and recommend someone else. So women had a lot of power back then. There's so many untruths that people have learned. History books written by non-Native people often tell a story from one perspective. Hollywood is the most damaging of all, and we'll get into some of that in a little bit. So if you hear things today for the first time, don't feel guilty. Don't feel like, why don't I know this? It's because you were never taught. It's because you were never shown. So how I would like to start this program is by sharing with you the Algonquin creation story that a lot of us, have grown up listening to for centuries. And it begins like this. In the beginning of time, there were 2 worlds. A sky world up above, where Sky Woman and her husband lived, and they had everything that they needed. It was a beautiful life up in that sky world. In the center, there was this tree of life growing, and everything that they needed in order to survive was growing on that one tree. Down below, there was nothing but water and darkness. Well, Sky Woman was with child, and she wasn't feeling very well. So she asked her husband to please dig up some of the roots from the tree of life Now, he didn't think that was a good idea. And they bickered and they argued a little bit. And it's not usually recommended to argue with a Native woman who's pregnant because she's going to win anyway. So he decided to dig up some of the roots. So as he was digging, he dug a little bit too hard, and a hole opened up that looked down into the darkness below. Well, Sky Woman was very curious. She grabbed onto that tree of life, and she leaned forward so that she'd look down to see what's inside of that hole. And all she saw were glowing eyes, pairs of eyes looking up. She was even more curious, so she leaned even more closer and more closer and more closer, and the ground beneath her opened up, and she started to fall, but not without her hand grasping and pulling some of those seeds from the tree of life. So she fell down through this hole, spinning and spinning and spinning. Now those pairs of eyes below, for the first time, saw light. Here's this beam of light coming down. And they were curious. They looked up and they said, it looks like something's falling. And they waited and waited, and they realized it was a living being. So they all got together and they said, how could we help this living being land safely? And just then a giant turtle rose up out of the water and said, the person could land on my back. And they discussed it a little bit, and they thought, well, she's coming down at a very fast rate. Maybe we need to slow her down a little bit first. So the water birds flew up, it was the swans, and they opened up their wings, and they let her land on their wings, and they slowly glided her down. Meanwhile, down below, the other animals are talking about how hard the turtle shell is and how it might not be suitable for a being to live on, this new being, not knowing what it was. So they decided to take turns swimming to the bottom of the water and grabbing handfuls of mud. One by one, different animals tried. Some of them were not successful. Some of them never returned. Finally, the very last one was Muskrat. And he wasn't a very good swimmer. And the others kind of doubted that he was going to be able to do any better than anyone else. But they encouraged him anyway. He swam down to the bottom of that water. And he started to lose his breath. But he grabbed onto a handful of mud. And he started swimming up. Bubbles were showing at the top of the water. And the animals were concerned. And suddenly, Muskrat pops up with a handful of mud. And he puts that mud on the back of that turtle, and they start to spread it out. And that mud starts to grow into hills and valleys. And they were satisfied. They thought, okay, now we have a safe place for this being to land. The swans came down, and they placed Sky Woman on the back of that turtle. And she was so filled with gratitude of all of these animals coming together, all of these animals worrying about her safety, that she started to dance on the back of that turtle. And she danced and she sang, and as she danced, she started sprinkling the seeds from the tree of life all over the back of that turtle. And soon, the plants, the trees, the things that were needed to survive started to grow on the back of that turtle. And for us, this is how Turtle Island began. For me, it embodies our beliefs. It embodies our beliefs that we are all equal, that no one being is more important than another, that they all have a purpose and they're all necessary and needed. And that carries forward into our beliefs about human beings. We don't feel that we are more important than anyone else. We don't feel that there's people that should be worshiped higher than us and that people are below us. We believe that we're all equal in this world. And it's such a liberating way to be when you get rid of those, those beliefs that some of the cultures put into you. So what I want to do is show you a little bit more about our culture, our way of thinking. And it all begins with our history. Through archaeological discoveries, we can tell that there were Native American people living here in Connecticut. That's the name of this place. Connecticut in the Algonquin language means place of the long water, referring to the Connecticut River. There's archaeological evidence that Native American people have been living here in Connecticut for 12,000 years. That's pretty amazing. Now, 12,000 years ago, Connecticut's completely different. There's glaciers covering most of the land. There's very little plant life, there's very little animals, but there are people here hunting and looking for those resources. The glaciers are holding back a lot of the water. So if you look at a map from that time period, the Long Island Sound isn't there. There's a connecting landmass from Rhode Island, Long Island, thank you. Sorry, just being me. And there's a lake in between, Lake Flushing. Now, small groups of people are coming here, looking for resources, living in temporary structures like a lean-to, gathering resources and such. The tools that they're using are made out of stone, bone, and wood. And it's not, like I say, it's not very easy during those times. 2,000 years later, things start to change. The climate starts to change. And 8,000 years later, those glaciers are melted. The waterways are running very quickly. The Long Island Sound appears. There's more people because there's more plant life growing and more animals in this area. So there's large groups of people sharing this land, going on what's called seasonal rounds. They're eating with the seasons. So let's say in the spring, they come up to Washington, Connecticut to gather fiddleheads, ferns, and strawberries. When they were finished gathering what they needed, would you want to carry heavy stone tools with you down to the summer location near the ocean? No, neither would they. So what they would do in each one of these seasonal locations is they would dig a hole, bury those stone tools, and mark it, and then move to their next location. These places that they bury things in are called caches, and caches were found all over Connecticut. Now, sometimes they didn't return to an area, and those items stayed in the ground. This is what archaeologists find that give them this deep, rich history of the people that lived here. The shape of the arrowheads are like a timeline for archaeologists. Where the stones come from, tell them where the people have come from, who they might have traded with. They could test those stones to see what types of food they were using as well. But in most cases, you're only seeing one perspective. Let me give you an example. This is a stone axe. The stone part is at least 7,000 to 8,000 years old, okay? Anything wood would have rotted in the ground, so this is replicated, but this is the real deal. My son and I went to a museum in Connecticut, and he saw an axe like this in the display case, and it said, "Primitive technology." My son looked at me and he said, "Mom, were my ancestors like cavemen or something? They weren't really bright." And I said, "Well, Junior, what makes you think that?" He said, "Look at that stone axe. You would have to whack away at a tree for a year to get it to fall down." And that's when I realized he was only seeing things through one eye, the archaeologist's point of view. He wasn't seeing things through the other eye, which is the traditional Native American knowledge. So I said, Junior, when we get home, we're going to chop a tree down the way our ancestors did. So when we got home, we went over to our river. We got handfuls of clay. We went up to the tree and we painted a stripe of clay around the tree about 2 feet up from the ground. And then I set the tree on fire down at the roots. It starts to burn and burn and burn. I grabbed 2 clamshells and I moved those red hot coals over to one side of the tree. Now one side of the tree is burning more than the other, and it does this. And I say, Junior, go grab that pointy boulder and help this tree fall down. So he banged away at it and boom. The sense of pride that came over him. Wow, Mom, that's brilliant. They weren't using that stone as an axe. They were using fire as a tool. Do you see the difference? We call it two-eyed seeing. Being able to use both eyes to see something in a more clear light. And when you do this, this could be applied to archaeology, anthropology, ecology. Who knows better how to keep things in balance than the culture that's been here for 12,000 years, right? So people need to open their minds up and look at other ways of knowing. I suggest that people look into their own histories, their own cultures, and learn the way that your people did things. Because a lot of these lessons were lost through commercialism. You know, the need to monetize everything made people lose respect for the gifts that we were given here on this earth. And it becomes more about making money than it does about what you actually need. We're surrounded by commercials on TV that tell you, you don't have enough, you're not good enough. Your phone's not good enough, your TV's not good enough, nothing's good enough. Your house, you know, you need to have more, you need to have more. We need to turn that off and be thankful for what we have and think twice about those things that we purchase. Because that economy is driven by our spending. So if we don't want certain things to happen, you know, we need to stop purchasing them. If we don't want plastic in our oceans, then we need to be mindful about buying water in a bottle or the clothing that we wear that's filled with plastics. People don't realize that. Get back to some of those natural, you know, resources, you know, that are good for this planet. So just wanted to give you a little explanation about why I do what I do, because I think it's important that people understand us in a different light. So we're at 8,000 years. "8,000 years ago, people shared this land. In our language, there is no word for owning land. How can you own land when so many other living beings depend upon it? You're just borrowing that land from future generations. So it's a different way of thinking. As I said, there were groups that were migrating through this land, looking for resources, and they were sharing resources. For example, if you had a territory and your territory didn't have any maple trees, you could certainly go to the neighboring territory and harvest some maple syrup from their resources. It was shared. There weren't these lines like we have now of this is mine, this is yours. It was shared. So it's a whole different way of thinking. We also, like I said, we believe that we are no more important than any other living being, including a bug on the ground. That bug on the ground has a purpose. It has a reason for being here. It's part of that web of life. And if you eliminate one piece of that web, the whole web collapses. And that's something that we have to be mindful of as well. In our culture, before any decision was made, certain questions were asked. How is this going to affect the children? How is this going to affect the land? How is this going to affect the 7 generations ahead of us? When I came into this world, I knew that my ancestors, 7 generations behind me, were asking those questions about everything that they did because they wanted me to enjoy the same beautiful earth that they do. And it's up to me in my lifetime to think 7 generations ahead. And if there's anything that, people pick up on today, my hope is that you think about that 7 generation principle and how you can, ensure that 7 generations from now, things will be beautiful. Native American people kept things in balance for all those years. It's only been in the last 450 that things have gotten bad with pollution, with running out of resources, and so on. So back to 8,000 years ago. As I said, those waterways were pretty, intense, a lot of rapids and such. A few thousand years later, those waterways slowed down, and indigenous people developed ways to travel on water. So the invention of a dugout canoe or a birch bark canoe meant that they no longer had to have the entire group move from place to place on seasonal rounds. Now a majority of the people could stay behind, and the hunters and gatherers could leave and return. This is what led to village life, where they had established villages. Now, I was having a conversation with somebody earlier. The types of homes they lived in here made sense for this area. Could you live in an igloo here in Connecticut? No, your house would melt. How about a teepee? A teepee was invented, designed, developed for a different lifestyle out in the plains. Out in the plains, their whole life revolved around chasing buffalo herds. They needed a house that could be easily collapsed and dragged with them, okay? We wouldn't want a house that's easily collapsible here in Connecticut when it snows, right? Plus, we didn't have buffalo, so we didn't have those hides to cover the outside of a teepee. Any hides that we had from deer or elk, we needed to keep us warm because of our climate. So we used materials that made sense. If you look out the window, what do you see a lot of? Trees, right? So the homes that they made here were made out of resources that made sense. Small homes were for the individual families, they're called wigwams. Larger home was called a longhouse, and that was for the chief or the leader. Now their home wasn't bigger because they were more important. It was because they had more responsibilities, such as taking care of the sick and the elderly, entertaining visitors and guests when they arrived. They would take care of the elders as well, so they needed a bigger structure. So that relationship that they have to all living beings, let's go there. When you have an open relationship with another living being, you're open to learning from that being, okay? So for example, maple syrup. They watch squirrels nibble and break a branch of a tree. And then on some trees, a little drip would form. And in the cold months, that drip would separate. There would be a brown colored substance and an icicle. And they noticed that the squirrels were coming back and eating that brown colored substance, and that was maple syrup. So that's how they understood that there was a resource in that tree that they could live on because they watched the squirrels do it. So having your mind open to learning from other living beings is pretty important, especially for their survival. I'm going to show you another example. Who's this guy? Skunk. What do we know about skunks? They're packing a powerful medicine, right? We know to stay away from them. When we see a skunk, we go, I'm not getting anywhere near there. But other animals have that same reaction to the skunk. So if I were sending my child out to collect berries, strawberries, that could be dangerous during certain times of year because bears are out there collecting those berries as well for their families. Now, every animal, including humans, has the same reaction when they see this stripe. I'm not going anywhere near there. So what they would do is they would have their children wear a skunk fur on their head, and a bear from a distance is going to see that stripe and he's going to say, I'm not going anywhere near there. So learning these things, learning these tactics were a way for them to survive. If they needed to make a winter coat, and they had two choices. They had the choice of beaver pelts or a big, huge bear hide. Most people think the bear hide would make the most sense because it's big. But understand your relatives. How does a bear live in the winter? How does a beaver live in the winter? A beaver is in and out of the water all year long. Its fur is dense and thick. It's waterproof. What does a bear do? He hibernates, right? Or sleeps. He can't even keep himself warm. So his fur is not going to keep you warm. So it's understanding that, having that relationship and that respect for other living beings, was how they were able to survive and thrive. Turtles. As I told you in the turtle creation story, turtles were very significant to indigenous people, right? We have ceremonies with turtle rattles and such. They're very, important to us. Now, you could use this as a resource to collect berries, collect water, shovel. I have a really big one that I used to put a rabbit fur inside of and rock my son back and forth. They loved it. But our people used it as a calendar. Being so in tune with what's going on in the world, what's going on around them, they notice something. They notice that there's 13 full moons. On the backs of turtles, there's 13 large plates, one to represent each one of those full moons. Now, in our culture, we have celebrations every full moon to give thanks to the Creator for the beautiful gifts that we are given, such as maple syrup, right? The moon before the maple syrup moon is called the moon of the crackling trees. That's when they're so frozen that when the wind blows, they crackle. The following moon is the maple moon. That's when those trees defrost and that beautiful, sticky sap starts flowing through that tree. And then there's the strawberry moon, there's the hunting moon, there's the frog moon. There's all different moon names based on the resources that they were going to be collecting during that time. So I think it's pretty cool. So there's 13 to represent each full moon. In between each full moon, there's 28 days. They would count 28 days on the small plates on the outside. So they had a sense of knowing and knowing how to prepare for what's coming up ahead. So we're at about 5,000 years ago now, with the introduction of village life. Our communities, there weren't boys' jobs and girls' jobs. That drove me crazy when they taught me that in school. People did things based on their abilities, okay? If, for example, each one of us, when we're young, we're given a bow and arrow. And then the elders would watch and see who's most talented with that hunting tool. If it happens to be a girl, well, that's an asset. She could be a hunter for the community. It would be silly to force a boy to be a hunter if that's not what his skills were. We also recognize 5 genders: male, female, females who are a bit masculine, like myself. I'm not a girly girl. I haven't worn makeup since 1977. Men who are, maybe a little bit more feminine. Maybe they like to work with their hands, right? And then 2 spirit people, people with the body of one gender and the spirit of another. And each one of these genders was recognized and honored for their ability to see life in different ways. Boy, I wish we can get back to those times, right? So, village life, no one had more or less than anyone else, okay? So no one had to steal. Because if you went out hunting, you were going to bring that food back and it was going to be shared amongst the entire community. If you worked in the garden, same thing. It was going to be shared responsibilities and shared outcomes as well. So, like I said, no one had more or less than anybody else. It's another way we can get back to, right? Helping those that are less fortunate than ourselves. About 1,000 years ago, something really cool happened. Through trade, corn makes its way up from South America to Connecticut. And for the first time, indigenous people here had a reliable food source. You could visually see how much food you're going to have when you look at your garden, right? When you go hunting and gathering, you don't know what you're going to come back with. Sometimes you come back empty-handed. So that was a major improvement in their lives. What I find fascinating is the power of our stories. Not only did the seeds make it from South America to Connecticut, but the method of planting was shared through storytelling as well. Stories about the 3 sisters. We planted differently. We planted in hills spaced far apart. In the middle, we planted corn, which grows up tall. Around the corn, we planted green beans. Green beans need something tall to wrap around. And on the bottom, we planted gourds or pumpkins or squash. Big leaves keeps the weeds down, keeps the moisture in the soil. Prickly vines keep the critters away. Now, they observed and passed down that knowledge from one generation to the next, from one area to the next, through these stories. We know today, based on science, why that way of gardening is so successful. Corn takes nitrogen out of the soil, and green beans puts nitrogen back in. So those hills are in balance and healthy year after year after year. The way we plant today, corn, we're depleting all the nutrients from the soil. And after a while, that soil becomes dead. And you have to do all this work, you have to add all these chemicals to get that soil back to, being healthy again. When if you just work with nature and observe what's working together, like I say, the power of the stories, though, to keep that information going. But our stories were often laughed at. For example, we have stories about giant beavers here in Connecticut. They laughed, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, they laughed. Giant beavers, silly native people. Well, lo and behold, they find the skeletal remains of a giant beaver. Imagine that. And that's from 10,000 years ago. So that shows you that our stories can go back that far. It's pretty incredible. I encourage everyone to go into your own cultures, learn your own stories. They're fascinating. stories of survival. Because colonization, forced assimilation, didn't just happen here to indigenous people. It happened all over the world, to so many different cultures. And we need to go back. I always say that each and every one of us here today is here because of the steps of our ancestors. My ancestors may have been here since time immemorial. Maybe some of yours came here escaping horrible conditions, wanting to start a new life in a new land. Think about that. Think about the courage that must have taken, okay? To go to an unknown place where you don't know what the weather's like, you don't know what kind of food, sometimes with nothing in your pocket. We need to honor that. We need to honor those journeys. Difficult choices needed to be made. And then some people were brought here against their will to be used as slaves, never to see their homelands again. I think we need to learn each other's stories and respect each other's stories and paths here, not to point fingers and blame, but to heal. Because nobody had it easy. You know, there were, like I say, difficult choices, difficult sacrifices. Indigenous people had to make choices of whether to assimilate, to forget who they were, you know, in order to fit in with this new culture that was here. And, you know, now some of those, you know, ancestors are being criticized. You know, they were doing the best they could. They were trying to adapt to a changing situation, you know. We need to honor that. We need to respect that. So, like I was saying, 12,000 years, everything's kept in balance. Yes, there were some wars between Native people, but not nearly as many as you might think. They had other ways of settling disputes. Lacrosse was one of them. Instead of going to war, they would challenge each other with a lacrosse game. Let's say they were, you know, wanting to expand their territory. That lacrosse game would go on for days and days and miles, and it ended when nobody could get up. What a civilized way to settle an argument. Often when children come to our museum for education programs, they're so fixated on, you know, the warring savages. And then I ask them this question: what were Native American people's weapons of war? Their hunting tools, bows and arrows, clubs, spears. What were Europeans' weapons of war? Guns, cannons, things designed specifically for that purpose. So tell me, whose priority was it? So then we get to 450 years ago, when the biggest change of all happens, and that's the introduction of new cultures. Now, at first, it was the Dutch and the French, and in the beginning, they had good relationships. They were here to trade, not to take over and conquer. So for the first time, indigenous people were able to trade for things that they never had in their lives before. Think about making clothing. You know, they had to hunt an animal, skin the animal, scrape the hide, treat the hide with fats and oils, which was the brains of the animal and urine, cut it with a stone knife, sew it with a bone needle. You know, the thread was part of the tendon from that deer. All that work. Well, now, with the introduction of Europeans, they could trade for cloth, for metal scissors, cooking pots, and such. And they, you know, in return would, you know, give the European people things that they might not have been exposed to before. Different foods, different furs, and such. So, unknowingly, through this trade, not only were these items being traded, but diseases were being traded. Diseases that didn't exist here because of a different lifestyle and different relationship with animals. Native American people didn't domesticate animals. They allowed them to run free. They didn't believe you could own an animal, let alone a human being, right? So Europeans on the other hand, domesticated animals had them close to their homes, sometimes in their homes. They walked through the streets where there was animal species. They built up an immune system and knowledge on how to treat those diseases that were spread by these animals. Native people never experienced that. So when they came down with these diseases, measles, cholera, whooping cough, plagues, they didn't know how to fight it. They didn't have immune systems that could handle it. It is said here in Connecticut, 80% of Connecticut's indigenous people died from disease. So now they're in a weakened state, easily pushed around. Who we are today, we are a mix of things. For example, myself, I'm a mixture of many different religions and traditional beliefs. It's something that works for me. It's my one-on-one with the Creator. For me, God, the Creator, is all the same thing. It's a higher power, something bigger than us, something that none of us could possibly explain, right? But I think each culture tries in telling stories that they think people can connect to and understand. We need to learn each other's stories, learn from each other's cultures, because there's much knowledge there that, could benefit everyone. Remember, looking at things through two eyes, not just one. Okay. Sorry, I could go on forever, guys. I told him he needs a hook. After the program, after we're finished here, we could have more discussions about anything that you see here. Thank you.
Oh gosh, thank you, Darlene. So much of what you said in that powerful and enlightening presentation really resonates with the beliefs we all share as Unitarian Universalists. And as Darlene said, after the service, you're welcome to come up and look at all of these artifacts and treasures she has brought with her and talk to her about, more of what you'd like to know. And as you exit the sanctuary on the way to the social hall, the ushers will be available to take your contributions and your pledges. So I thank you, Darlene, so very, very much. Now is the time when we extinguish the chalice. The words of extinguishing the chalice are in your order of service, but I bet most of you know them by heart by now. So say with me, we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Blessed be, namaste, amen, and magwesh, magwech. Thank you.
We'd like to invite the folk group up for one more presentation for our postlude.
We can all sing together, Gather the Spirit, hymn. It's on page 347 in your hymnal.